Good morning. It is Saturday, May the 28th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, fossil fuels, and Hondo, the finishing of Chapter 11. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for May the 28th. Understand the blessing of leadership. I control the course of world events. I remove kings and set up other kings. I give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. You should be subject to the governing authorities because they have been appointed by me. Pray, intercede, and give thanks for all men, all kings, and all who are in authority. Do not be like the dreamers who reject authority and speak evil of dignitaries. Daniel 2:21, Romans 13:1, Timothy 2:1, and Jude 8. Prayer declaration. Power and might are in your hands, Lord. It is at your discretion that people are made great and given strength. I will obey and be submissive to those who rule over me. I pray, intercede, and give thanks for all men and all who are in authority. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, Biblical Principles to Defeat the Devil for May the 28th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded and asks why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number one, a constitutional amendment banning abortion throughout the country. Number two, make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number three, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number 4, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liability to all government regulators. Number 5, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number 6, the immediate repeal of all dictator laws. Number 7, the reinstatement of writs of outlawry. Number 8, government-sponsored recalls, ballot initiatives, and referendums. Number 9, a flexible minimum wage. Number 10, means-tested health care. And number 11, the immediate and permanent prohibition of investment banking by any office holder. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. Quote, the real problem is that workers are not so much underpaid as they are underskilled. And the real task is to help those people become skilled. Congress cannot do this simply by declaring that as of such and such a date, everybody's productive output is now worth $7.25 per hour or $15 per hour or whatever. This makes about as much sense and does just as much harm as doctors curing patients simply by declaring that they are cured. Unquote. Walter Williams. If everyone in the minimum wage policy debate could absorb this message, the entire debate could go away. We don't lose weight by altering our scales, and we don't solve for the value of output, the price of wages, by declaring the value to be higher. We solve for output, that is the value of the productivity. If the same effort went into cultivating the skills of our workforce as goes into altering the free exchange involved in labor transactions, we could end this controversy once and for all. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now the moral case for fossil fuels. So I'm in chapter 2, I think. Yeah, second part of chapter 2. And so the book is basically, again, it's an FYI. As in terms of defeating the left, you're not going to use much of what's being said in this book to directly defeat the left. This is more for your own confidence, right? So that you know that being on the side of fossil fuels is actually the correct place to be. Or as I like to say it, the thing that we need to do as true conservatives is fight the left for the supremacy on all of the issues, right? So one of those issues is the environment. And so we need to be able to go with a straight face and tell the world, tell everybody in the United States of America that we as Republicans, we as conservatives are the party of environmentalism, and that oil is what's best. All fossil fuels are what's best for the environment. Okay, so this book will help to give you confidence in knowing that. So because if you know it, then you're going to act with confidence when you're talking to other people, whether they're social or lefties or righties. Anyways, this section is called Future Energy Resources. Here's a trick question I like to ask when I do public speaking. Is oil a valuable natural resource? Almost everyone answers yes, even when I tell them it's a trick question. My answer is no, because oil or coal or natural gas or uranium or aluminum for that matter is not naturally a resource. If we understand this, we understand why we can be incredibly optimistic about the future potential of fossil fuels and future sources of energy. A resource is something that's available and useful or usable for human benefit. I'll focus on oil here because it is the resource that people most fear will disappear. Before the 1850s, oil was not a resource. It was naturally useless. It was a distinct raw material, to be sure, with the potential to become valuable, just as sand has the potential to become a microchip. But oil had very little use. In fact, in many cases, it was a nuisance. Drillers seeking underground saltwater deposits to distill into salt were annoyed by the presence of this rock oil. Additionally, oil was not a treasure not a resource because it was hidden and trapped, invisible and inaccessible. What turned oil from a potential resource to an actual resource was human ingenuity. The ingenuity of chemist Benjamin Silliman Jr., who refined petroleum into kerosene. The ingenuity of George Bissell, who targeted Titusville, Pennsylvania, as a location likely to have underground oil, and the ingenuity of Edwin Drake, who created the first successful oil well in 1859 at 69.5 feet underground. It was only thanks to their ingenuity that useless goo became a resource. The history of oil is a history of resource creation. For example, crude oil, through a process of boiling, distilling, could be refined into 50 or 60% kerosene, used for lighting. But then the rest of the crude oil wasn't a resource. It was often pure waste, dumped in a lake, until human ingenuity made it so. In the 19th century, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil progressively figured out how to create value out of every fraction of a barrel containing numerous types of hydrocarbons of different shapes, sizes, and masses. They created wax out of one part of the barrel, lubricants, over 300 varieties, out of another, and asphalt out of another. In the 20th century, modern chemistry made oil not only the most important fuel, but also the most important raw material in civilization. Chemists can break down the molecules in a barrel of oil into small parts, and then reassemble them into an unbelievable variety of polymers, including modern plastics. While you think of oil in your cars as in the gas tank, in fact, there's more oil in the materials in the car than in the gas tank. The rubber tires are made of oil, the paint and waterproofing are made of oil, the plastic dent-resistant bumper is made of oil, the stuffing inside the seats is made of oil, and in most cars, the entire interior is one form of oil fabric or synthetic material or another, because oil is such a cheap and effective way to make things. When a policeman has his life saved by a bulletproof vest, when a firefighter has his life saved by a fireproof jacket, that is oil. That is something that was once a useless raw material, now made into a resource. What is true of oil is true of essentially every other resource. They need to be created by transforming potential into actual. Coal was not an electricity resource or a source of motive power until a coal-fired steam engine. Natural gas was actually a deadly force, something that exploded when you drilled for oil, until safe drilling and storage techniques could harness it. Aluminum, one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, was completely useless a few hundred years ago. Ultimately, an energy resource is just matter and energy transformed to meet human needs. Well, the planet we live on is 100% matter and energy, 100% potential resource. To say we've only scratched the surface is to significantly understate how little of this planet's potential we've unlocked. We already know that we have enough of a combination of fossil fuels and nuclear power to last thousands and thousands of years. For us today, that's morally enough. It's time to focus on the 7 billion of us here and now who will live better with more energy and live worse, or not at all, with less. What energy resources should we use now and in the future? We have a brilliant system for deciding this, the price system of supply and demand. All things being equal, if it takes fewer resources, including human time, to produce something, the price goes down. If it takes more resources, the price goes up. Thus, prices reflect how efficient a use of existing resources it is to create a new resource for a given purpose. When the cost of computers comes down, that means that all the components and their composition can be created more cheaply than before. Similarly, the form of energy we use will be the one that, based on the best technology available, which is always evolving, can do the best job for the lowest price. Every day we make a choice. Is coal or oil or gas the best way of accomplishing a given goal? Or is something else? For the last several hundred years, the answer to what do we replace yesterday's fossil fuels with has been new fossil fuels. As soon as that doesn't make sense, typically when it becomes prohibitively expensive or when a better alternative is available, it won't happen. Part of the process of resource evolution is that we will find new ways to get what is considered to be the same resource by more technically complicated means. This is often characterized negatively with such expressions as, We've gotten all the easy oil. Now we're going after the dirtiest oil, or we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. The expression scraping the bottom of the barrel, by the way, comes from the phenomenon of the oil in a barrel existing in different fractions from heavy to light. The heavy fractions sit at the bottom of the barrel, and the heaviest, like asphaltum, which goes into asphalt, can be hard to scrape out and impossible to use. The view is that when we use a finite non-renewable resource like fossil fuels, we'll have to go to progressively more difficult places to get it, which is assumed to be a bad thing. But why? Every resource technology involves starting with easier problems and moving toward harder problems. When I read, we're using dirtier and dirtier oil, or we're having to scour further depths to get oil, I think, what is the appropriate length to go to get oil? Should we have stopped at 69.5 feet? At every stage, one could be accused of scraping the bottom of the barrel. But think forward 200 years. The earth is full of elements at the crust and below. Ditto for the bottom of the ocean. Someday, we will likely have technology to mine the ocean floor more efficiently than we can mine at the surface today. What is wrong with going to that frontier? How is that any different from going to space? Now, it makes no sense to go to such great lengths to get oil if it's not efficient, i.e. if there are better alternatives. But there will likely be some element that is most efficient to get from very far below ground, from very far below ground. The most forward-looking policy toward energy use is always use the most competitive form of energy. I like to call the most competitive ones progressive energy, because they are part of a process of continental improvement, of finding the best way to get energy from the Earth's effectively unlimited stockpile of potential energy resources. Our concern for the future should not be running out of energy resources. It should be running out of the freedom to create energy resources, including our number one energy resource today, fossil fuels. Every calorie matters. Because we've never lived without fossil fuel energy, it's hard to imagine life without its benefits. But given that thought leaders are proposing exactly that, it's important to grasp just how big a difference fossil fuels have made in our lives. To get a big picture view of the difference energy and machines make in our lives, we have a graph here that shows from AD 1 to the present, featuring data from the Angus Madison survey. And basically it shows that the more fossil fuels that we have used, the higher, yes, there's CO2 emissions, but also the higher life expectancy and the higher gross domestic product per person, and the bigger the population. Notice that starting in the year 1800, the metrics of life expectancy and GDP rocket up. In school, we learned this was the time of the Industrial Revolution, although at least in my case, the problems of it were emphasized much more than the doubling of human life expectancy and the far more than doubling of individual income. What exactly does the term Industrial Revolution mean? Well, it was a revolution in industry, which means our ability to do physical work to be more productive, which in practice meant an energy revolution. Thanks to the world's first source of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, coal-powered steam engine technology, every industry became more productive. Agriculture, manufacturing, transportation. The people who went through the Industrial Revolution had a perspective that is hard for us to recapture, but is essential for us to get. An understanding of just how vital it is for us to have access to cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. Because the more we have, the more ability we have, and the less we have, the more we see just how weak we are without high energy machines. I stress cheap, plentiful, and reliable because anything less than that isn't useful. Just like the expensive, scarce, unreliable electricity at the Gambian hospital. Before the Industrial Revolution, there were machines and there were sources of energy. There just wasn't cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for the vast majority of people. Take this 1865 comment by William Stanley Jevons, a legendary theoretical and applied economist, in his book, The Coal Question. Coal was then the cheapest and most reliable source of energy, not only for illumination, which is only one use of energy, but also for powering machines to do far more mechanical work than human beings can with our muscles. Coal, in truth, stands not beside but entirely above other commodities. It is the material energy of the country, the universal aid, the factor in everything we do. New applications of coal are of an unlimited character. In the command of force, molecular and mechanical, we have the key to all the infinite varieties of change in place or kind of which nature is capable. No chemical or mechanical operation, perhaps, is quite impossible to us, and invention consists in discovering those which are useful and commercially practicable." Unquote. Jevons was worried that we were running out of coal, a concern we'll discuss later in the chapter. Notice how emotional he is about it. Quote, "With coal, almost any feat is possible or easy. Without it, we are thrown back into the laborious poverty of early times." Unquote. A letter in response to Jevons is even more vivid about what the loss of coal energy would have meant. Quote, "Coal is everything to us. Without coal, our factories will become idle, our foundries and workshops will be still as the grave. The locomotive will rust in the shed, and the rail will be buried in the weeds. Our streets will be dark, our houses uninhabitable. Our rivers will forget the paddle wheel, and we shall again be separated by days from France, by months from the United States. The post will lengthen its periods and protract its dates. 1,000 special arts and manufacturers, one by one, then in a crowd, will fly will fly the empty soil, as boon companions are said to disappear when the cask is dry." Unquote. And here's how it all ends. Quote, "We shall miss our grand dependence as a man misses his companion, his fortune, or a limb, every hour and at every turn reminded of the irreparable loss." Unquote. One thing to note, this was at a time in history when, because of early stage technology, coal pollution in England was far, far worse than, say, even China experiences today. And yet these commentators don't even mention it. That's how valuable they saw energy as being to their very ability to survive. Nothing was more important. As we'll see, looking at modern fossil fuel technology, we've progressed incredibly in pollution reduction technology, but it's worth remembering that to the people who experience the need for energy most directly, it's worth pretty much any price. In the same way that you'll put up with a lot of side effects to take a life-saving drug. And life-saving drugs, like everything else we value, depend on access to cheap, plentiful, reliable energy to produce, to transport, to package, to refrigerate. When we talk about different sources of energy, we're talking about different technologies that are better or worse at producing energy with the resources we have. If we choose the most capable technologies, we get more energy. If we choose the less capable ones, we get less. It's that simple. When someone says, let's use solar, he is usually unwittingly saying, let's have less energy with which to improve our lives. There's no limit to the amount of energy we can use to improve our lives. And in a world where we produce only 1/4 as much energy as would be necessary for everyone to live like Americans, every machine calorie counts. One realm in which energy is particularly life or death is in agriculture. The fossil fuel industry has revolutionized agriculture to the benefit of billions and gotten no credit. More fossil fuels, more food. How the oil industry solved world hunger. Paul Ehrlich declared in the 1968 sensation, The Population Bomb, that the battle to feed humanity is over. And he was in good company. In 1969, the New York Times reported, while there have always been famines and warnings of famine, food experts generally agree that the situation now is substantially different. The problem is becoming so acute that every nation, institution, and every human being will ultimately be affected. A group of leading American intellectuals wrote an open letter declaring, quote, "The world as we know it will likely be ruined before the year 2000. World food production cannot keep pace with the galloping growth of population," unquote. In 1968, the world's population was 3.6 billion. Since then, it has doubled, yet the average person is better fed than he was in 1968. This seeming miracle was due to a combination of the fossil fuel industry and genetic science, such as the achievements of the great Norman Borlaug, who bred new revolutionary wheat varieties and introduced new farming techniques to Mexico, India, Pakistan, China, and parts of South America. Modern agriculture, like every modern industry, runs on machines, and fossil fuel energy is our leading source of machine food. Therefore, fossil fuel energy is the food of food. For example, oil-powered mechanization causes a dramatic increase in the amount of farmland that can be cultivated per worker. And so that's the end of this section of Chapter 2 of the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And again, this is going to be an excellent resource because when we get bombarded by the left in the media day after day after day about how crappy fossil fuels are and their pipe dreams of perfect society with electric cars and all that is so much better and superior. And then you read a book like this and you begin to see that how valuable fossil fuels are for us in every possible and conceivable way. So, but again, it's more for your own confidence rather than to use against the lefties in your life. It's not something you want to carry around under your arm, and when somebody says, oh, well, electric vehicles, and then you whip out the book and look something up. That's not really the point of why I'm reading this to you. I want you to be confident that fossil fuels are the way to go. So, back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Hondo. And I believe we're in chapter 11 here, the second part. And so we're at the part where, because each chapter goes back and forth between the different characters. And right now this chapter is about Angelo and her son. And so what has happened so far in the chapter is that what happened overall is that Vittoro, who is an Apache chief, has made a blood brother of Angelo's son, Johnny. And so now Vittoro wants her to marry one of his braves. He's getting rather impatient about it. He's had the braves show up so she can pick which one she wants. And, of course, she doesn't want to do that. She doesn't want to grow up as an Apache or have Johnny grow up as an Apache. So she really wants to have her husband is who knows where. He hasn't been around for months, and she doesn't know whether he's alive or dead. And actually the person she'd rather have raise her kid is Hondo Lane. But she doesn't know where he is either. He was going back to the fort, and so she has no idea where he is right now. So right now, because Vittoro has basically given her until the rainy season to make up her mind. So I don't know exactly how long that is, whether it's days, weeks, or months. But she's formulating a plan right now in this chapter as to how to escape, to try to get away from her ranch and get away from Vittoro and get to the fort. So she's checking the horses right now. She could not conquer them as Hondo had done, but the horse she needed was a much less dangerous animal. And she'd seen both her father and Hondo make friends with the horse until the battle was half won. Those were the tactics she would use. They were all that remained to her. Once her decision was made, she planned every move with that in mind. There's an old lock. Perhaps the Indians could break it, but she could at least try to protect her house until she returned. She would wait until every other chance was gone. Perhaps she might escape during the rain. With the rain to wipe out her tracks, their chances would be greater. Yet that meant exposing Johnny to the fury of the storm. For storm it would be when the planting rain came. It was almost midnight before Angie finally retired. During most of that time, she had tried to plan her course of action. At the last moment, she might have to act entirely opposite to her decided course, but she would have to have a plan. What to do would depend on the events of the moment, but the very fact that she had a plan gave her confidence and feeling of greater security. Yet even as her eyes closed, her last conscious thought was that Hondo Lane might return, and the question remained in her mind. What had happened between them that she should feel so sure of how he felt? So little had been said, so little done. Yet the knowledge was there, and a deep inner realization that this was the man with whom she could be happy. This was the man with whom she wanted to live out her years. And it could never be, even if she escaped the Indians, if she survived all the fighting, and if Hondo felt about her as she felt about him, there was still no chance for happiness for either of them. There was always Ed Lowe. He might be dead, but Angie was not prepared to believe that. And he was her husband, the father of her child. At daybreak, an idea came to her. The Apaches would know how many horses were in the corral, and when 2 were missing, they would immediately know she had fled. But for that, she could plan. That very morning, she led out 2 of the horses and picketed them on the grass in the trees and out of sight of any passing Indians. She would do this occasionally while still remaining in sight herself. In that way, the Indians would not be suspicious when they noticed the missing horses. There were several places they could be picketed out of sight and where they could not be found without a search. Thus, their disappearance would not be sudden and not a cause for investigation. Yet, even as she worked and planned, Angie knew that her chances of escape were small. Only one thing made her decision to make the attempt one from which she could not retreat. There was no other way. She was hanging out her wash when she heard approaching horses. Turning quickly, she saw that 3 Indians had ridden their ponies into the ranch yard. Scarcely 2 hours after the horses had been moved, and the Indians were here. One of them was Silva. They rode around the corral, noting the tracks. One of them rode in the direction the horses had gone, then returned, saying something to Silva. He shrugged, then walked his pony toward Angie. She faced him, standing very straight, her face composed. To show terror could mean death, as she knew that of them all, Silva feared Vittorio less than the rest. He was, she knew, some sort of sub-chief. "What do you want?" He looked at her insolently. "Maybe soon you be my squaw." "You?" Her contempt was plain. "Of all the braves in the lodge of the Apache, you would be the last fighter of women." Silva's nostrils flared and temper quickened in his eyes. It would not do to tempt this man too far, she realized. His was a hair-trigger temper, and he was naturally vindictive, nor had he forgotten his defeat by her child. The story must have aroused many a chuckle in the wiki-ups. One of the 2 braves riding with him was Emiliano. She remembered him instantly as one of those who had come with Vittorio to the squaw-seeking ceremony. He was a lean and powerful Indian, not the sort to be intimidated. "I fight no woman," Silva's temper lashed at her. "I kill soldier. I count plenty coup." Sensing sympathy from the other Indian, she answered him, "And my child counted coup over you, brave warrior, and he is but 6 summers. Think, brave warrior," her contempt was thick. "What if he had been 12? Silva started forward as if prodded with a lance, but Emiliano's voice rang sharply. Silva whirled his horse, and the 2 Indians faced each other, tempers flaring. The 3rd Apache looked at her, and she thought she detected a faint smile on his face. Whatever was said between Silva and Emiliano, the former suddenly wheeled his horse and moved away. The others hesitated a moment, and then Angie said quietly, "Thank you, Emiliano. I shall speak of this to Vittorio." His eyes held her briefly, then the 2 wheeled their ponies and followed after Silva. It was only then that reaction set in. What if Emiliano had not been there? What if Silva had been with him had with him some braves more of his own nature? He would never, she knew instinctively, make this mistake again. Suddenly her knees began to tremble and the muscles in her legs shook uncontrollably. She got to the house and sat down on the steps, and it was a long time before she could move. She had been a fool to stay on. She had been a silly fool. What good would she be to her son if they were taken to an Indian village? What good would the ranch be to either of them? She would think no more of Hondo Lane. She would not think of Ed. Neither of them would come. The latter was faithless and vacillating. The former had no reason to return. No real reason. She was a lonely woman, and her loneliness had magnified his respect and a chance kiss into something that was not there. She would think of one thing only, escape. When planting rain came, she would go. And if the rains were hard, they would wash out her tracks, and she would take a direction where they might not ever expect her. Then she might escape. In the night, she was awakened suddenly. A waiting moment of silence, then a sudden rush of hooves across the hard-packed yard, then a hoarse cry. A long moment before there was no sound, then a shot, and after it a long-drawn wailing scream, as of a mortal soul in pain. Crouching by the window, rifle in hand, she peered out and she could see nothing. Only the moonlight on the cottonwood leaves, only the white-seeming roof of the stable, only the empty hills. A dream? No, Johnny was crouching beside her, trembling, partly from cold and partly fear. He tugged at her arm. Mommy, what was that? What happened? Did the man come back? Did the man come back? She felt something like horror mounting within her. Had he come back and been killed at her door? There was no more sleep. When Johnny was safely in bed, she wrapped a blanket around her and sat by the window, the rifle at her hand. Slowly, with a quiet chill, the night passed. A faint yellow faded the eastern sky. The tips of the cottonwoods turned gold. Like the sun-tipped lances of a moving army, the shadows in the yard drew back, hiding in the barn and under the brush along the stream, crouching there. A quail sent out an inquiring call, and somewhere across the basin, another quail responded. It was morning. And that's the end of chapter 11 for the book Hondo. And I read this, and it's a true conservative type book because it deals with character. These are people that are to be judged by their character, not their personalities. Very often, many of these characters don't have much in the way of a personality. Hondo Lane isn't somebody that, none of them are really very bubbly. They're not people whose smiles would light up your room. They're not quick with a joke to light up your smoke. But they are, they're better than that. They're deeper than that. They're reliable. They're conscientious. They're loyal. Angie Lowe demonstrates an enormous amount of loyalty to a husband who doesn't reciprocate. And so anyways, but you have good character and bad character. Ed Lowe represents the bad character. Hondo Lane, Angie Lowe represent good character. So that's why I think this book is so important to read. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and reminding you to listen to the John and Ken Show on KFI AM 640, Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Also, KFI needs to bring back Bryan-Suits and his show, The Dark Secret Place. Hashtag bring back Bryan-Suits. Until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.